I want to welcome Greg White, who is the Chief of Staff and General Counsel, I wanted to get that right, with the Massachusetts Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulations.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
No, it's
Appreciate
great
it.
to see you and meet you and find out more about what the Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulations do.
Sure.
I know that you're everywhere in
Yep.
terms of businesses that are impacted by and those of us who are consumers by your organization.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, most people hear consumer affairs and automatically think of the Attorney General's office. We're a separate state agency. The Attorney General's office, that's a big part of what they do. They have the Consumer Protection Unit, but we're a separate state agency with our own mandate. And Undersecretary Chapman likes to say that we regulate Main Street America. You can't go down any Main Street without coming across an entity that we regulate. So we have 5 divisions under us. We have the Division of Banks, which oversees state chartered banks and credit unions. There are about 200 of them in Massachusetts with combined assets of $400,000. They oversee the non-depository lenders, which are the debt collectors, check cashing businesses, amongst other things. We oversee the Division of Insurance, which oversees and regulates about 1,600 insurance companies in Massachusetts with over 100,000 producers. We oversee the Division of Standards, which has a multifaceted role. They inspect fuel pumps, they inspect fuel delivery trucks, they inspect scanners at convenience stores and gas stations. They inspect and oversee auto body repair and glass repair shops, among other things.
Wow.
We have the Department of Telecommunications and Cable, which regulates the telecommunications and cable industry. And lastly, we have the Division of Professional Licensure, which oversees and licenses about 500,000 licensees in Massachusetts, from chiropractors to accountants to electricians, plumbers, sheet metal workers, and they have a pretty broad mandate.
Oh, wow. You have a lot of responsibility.
Yes, yeah.
A couple of things that jumped out at me that I wanted to talk about was the do not call list.
Yes.
Is part of it.
Okay.
How come, even though I'm still on the do not call,
Yes.
how come we're still getting calls?
Well, one of our mandates within the Office of Consumer Affairs is we oversee the do not call list along with the federal government. The problem is, and I was having this discussion with one of your staff when we came in, and we're talking about the various scams out there, and one of which is the National Grid scam, where they call in and say, if you don't want another call, hit 9 or 2 or whatnot, and then the next day you get a call on a different number. Well, they're scams. They're out to commit fraud on a consumer. So a do not call list is not going to deter them from that behavior. Right. What I suggest to consumers is to invest in an answering machine. The problem is most people don't have landlines anymore. I think my wife and I are one of the few residents, but
I have one too.
But scammers and telemarketers hate those because it acts as a bridge between the entity and the consumer. And so I'll come home at night and there'll be a half a dozen ones, and most of them are scams. The IRS scam, purporting to be the IRS or what have you. But to answer your question, yes, we oversee the do not call list, and you're more than welcome to register with our office. And if it's a legitimate business, they're going to adhere to it. If it's a scammer, they're not, because they're out to commit fraud.
Does anybody throw anybody in jail? That's
Well,
what I knew I was going to meet you. That's what friends of mine asked. Does anybody ever go to jail for
violating the do
Yes.
not call list? Not likely. But what they are doing is they're going after these scammers. Recently, the U.S. Attorney's Office in one of the jurisdictions indicted a number of individuals on the IRS scam. And that's been around from the dawn of ages, but people are still being victimized by that. So. We oversee the do not call list, amongst other things.
And then the other topic that I wanted to make sure we got to while we had time was the what you do with gas stations.
Okay. So the Division of Standards is responsible for licensing and inspecting fuel pumps. If your town or city, or town I should say, is under 5,000, then our inspectors will come out and inspect your fuel pumps, and they do it on an annual basis. If you're above 5,000, you can contract with the Division of Standards, and we will do the service of what a local inspector would do. Right now, we have about 67 towns that we inspect for. But they'll go out and inspect the fuel pumps. They also inspect fuel delivery trucks to make sure that what is being purported or going into your tank is in fact going into it. We can talk a little later on about scams or a fraud, but one of the things that they're very involved in is skimming devices, which is becoming a real issue, not only here in Massachusetts, but throughout the United States. But they're responsible for inspecting gas stations, the pumps, to ensure that what is being advertised is in fact going into your gas tank.
We're going to talk about things that really affect all of us, and one of those things is identity theft and people being able to, in one fashion or another, to interrupt our lives by stealing our identities, and how your office gets involved with that.
Sure. Well, one of our mandates is overseeing the data breach notification. If you're an entity in Massachusetts and you hold personal information of Massachusetts resident, that information's been compromised, you're required to notify our office, the Office of Consumer Affairs, as well as the Attorney General's office. We maintain a database that people can readily access. And last year alone, we had over 2,000 breaches that we are notified of.
So, excuse me, those are like businesses, retailers, or other stores?
Yeah,
who are
which is one of the main sources of breaches.
Right.
You know, we were talking during the break about identity theft. And, you know, when I started my career as an attorney, I was a prosecutor for 10 years in Worcester and 14 overall. Back then, identity theft consisted or came about as a result of you or I losing our wallet.
Right.
Back in the day, your license number had your social security number, so they were off and running. Now, people don't even have to leave their homes. They can be halfway across the world and hack into your system. Someone said to me on one of the shows recently, how do you prevent yourself from being a victim of identity theft? And I said, well, go back to the Stone Ages. Don't use credit cards. Don't use a computer. Don't interact on social media. But that's not practical. It's not. You're not going to be able to exist in that world anymore. It's not a question of matter of whether or not you or I are going to be a victim of identity theft. That's a given. The only issue is when it's going to happen and how often it's going to happen. Recently, this past year, I was notified by my mortgage company that my information had been compromised. That same week, I was notified that as a former member of a presidential administration working in Washington, my information had been compromised. So within 7 days, I had been compromised in terms of my prior employment as well as my mortgage. Wow. And there's steps that one can take to help reduce your exposure if in fact you've been a victim of identity theft. You know, first and foremost, you would notify your financial institution and have your card
change your card.
Changed.
Yeah, sure.
One of the most important things, though, is you can put a freeze on your credit. Folks don't know that. You can also request your credit report, and by law, you're entitled to receive a free one once a year. And look at that to see if, in fact, what is being purported on that is, in fact, attributed to you. Putting a freeze is one of the most significant ways that you can limit your exposure.
Oh, okay.
We were talking about home improvement. This past year, my wife and I had some work done. We were meeting with a contractor, and one of his staff learned that I was with the Office of Consumer Affairs, and she said to me, oh, you know, recently I was a victim of identity theft. And I said, oh, how did that come about? She said, well, I went to refinance on my home, and I found out that someone had used my information to purchase a condominium in my name and purchase a brand new car. And it wasn't until they ran her credit report that this was disclosed. She wouldn't have found out about it until they started defaulting on the payments. So by putting a freeze on that, that ensures that at least high-level or high-ticket items won't go through.
Is that something we all should do?
I think it's a great idea. In fact, as a result of this, I was offered a free credit freeze for a period of time, so I put it on. My wife and I went to purchase a high-ticket item, electronics, and I went in there and they said, well, listen, if you want to open a credit card, you get 10% off. And I said, no, I'd just like to pay it. They said, you can pay it. Just open it up, get the 10% off and pay it. And I said, great. Gave them my information, and they came back and they said, well, we got corporate on the line, it's been declined. And I got on the line, they said, did you recently put a freeze on it?
Oh, sure.
I had forgotten about it. And they said, do you want to remove it? I said, no, we use my wife's information, you know. But the fact of the matter is, it does prevent someone from using your information should you be a victim of identity.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
'Cause I've heard both sides of should you put a freeze on,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I don't even know if it costs money to do that. I believe it does, right?
Well, if you've been a victim, then it's free. But you know, it's worth it.
Okay.
It's worth it.
Well, that's good advice.
Yeah,
Then. I think
absolutely. So, so we oversee the data breach, and as a result of which, you know, we're aware of what's going on out there. Also, as part of the Office of Consumer Affairs, we oversee the consumer hotline. We have 4 students from Northeastern, co-op students, who are with us. We break it up into 2 segments. One starts in January and goes through June. One starts in July and goes through December. We have a terrific group of students who have been manning the lines. They take hundreds of calls a day, and many of the calls involved identity theft and what you can do to prevent it. One of the things that, you know, they're not attorneys, they're not there to offer legal advice, but there's suggestions that are often. One of the things is changing your password and changing it often, which is a very common mistake. People attribute a password to something that can easily be identified with.
Sure.
I'll tell you a very quick story. Recently, my brother, who lives in Europe, contacted me. He said, you need to change your password, your system's been hacked. I went online, changed it to you know, names and numbers that couldn't be associated with me. So long that recently my son and I were running a half marathon in Pennsylvania, and the gun was about to go off, and I was trying to access iTunes. So we said, what's your password? So by the time I gave it to him, the gun had gone off and everyone had run by us. But the fact of the matter is no one's going to be hacking into my system. So
And then the other part of that has to do with these.
it's skimming devices, yes. And again, as we talked about during the break, unfortunately, they're out there. We're finding them in ATM machines. We're finding them in gas pumps. We're finding them on price scanners at department stores. Our Division of Banks, which oversees state-chartered banks and credit unions, this past year we're notified that an ATM down in the South Shore had been compromised and 1,000 consumers' information had been breached. Last year we found 4 skimming devices in a small radius out in the western part of the state by our inspectors inspecting fuel pumps. There are things that you can do. You know, one of the things are these sleeves that you can purchase. You put your credit card in there and it prevents them from accessing your information. Now, that only helps with handheld skimming devices,
Right.
because as we talked about.
But as holiday season comes along,
Yep.
and you're out shopping, you're out
Absolutely.
traveling more, this is handy enough that I'm going to get myself.
Absolutely, and one of the things that it does, as we talked about, it prevents someone with a handheld skimming device, which they're using in gas and airports and bus stations and train stations. They'll walk up, brush up against you, and download your information. So these sleeves protect your information.
It's a crazy world we live in.
It is.
And I'm
It
glad that
is.
you're trying to do something.
Well,
Your department's trying to do something.
We're
to help
out
us.
there, and we're trying to stay a step ahead, but as we, again, talked about during the break, you know, one of the things that we advise consumers is that when you pump your gas, look to see if there's a protective seal on it. If that's been breached, notify the proprietor. Recently, our inspectors notified us that they've come up with counterfeiting
Wow.
seals. So they'll breach the seal and then they'll place one on top of it.
Hard to do anything about that. You can't pump the gas
Yeah,
without
yeah,
using a gas.
yeah, exactly. And we don't advise consumers to take things into their own hands. Recently, there was a correction officer who was attending a concert down in Providence, and he went to take some money out of an ATM machine, and he noticed that the facade on it was ajar. So he pulled it off, and lo and behold, there was a skimming device.
And not recommended for all of us to do that.
No, because there's forensic evidence there. You notify the bank, they'll notify the local officials, will notify the FBI and Secret Service, and they'll go ahead and
To say nothing that if we did that and we were wrong.
Right,
That's not a, that's probably
yeah,
not.
and it's all on camera.
It's
too.
all on camera.
Exactly.
One of the things that your office gets very involved with is construction contractors, and there's a fund that I didn't know anything about.
Yep.
We did a little research. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that because that affects anybody potentially who's doing work around their
Absolutely.
home.
One of the most important programs that we oversee at the Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulation is the Home Improvement Contracting Program. It's been around for years, and basically it requires any contractor who is doing home improvement work in Massachusetts that they register with our office. And part of our program is the registration process, as well as the complaint process that I can talk about in a moment, as well as the guarantee fund. Most of the work that you have, home improvement that's done on your home, if in fact it meets the definition, requires a home improvement contracting license. There's a few exceptions like interior painting, above ground pools, blacktopping your driveway. They don't require a home improvement contracting registration, but the majority do. And as we talked about during the break, people spend a lot of money every year on home improvement contracting. Sure. In fact, that's probably your biggest asset. And you can't do the smallest job without, in fact, spending thousands of dollars. Last year alone, consumers in Massachusetts spent over $3 billion on home improvement contracting in Massachusetts. So there are certain things that you should be aware of as a consumer. Number one, do your due diligence. You know, we, again, talking before the show, you get word of mouth from a friend, from a neighbor who's had a good experience. That's important, but that doesn't guarantee anything, right? So you want to make sure that they're in fact registered, and you can contact our office, you can go online and determine whether or not they're in fact registered. You also want to check to see if they had any complaints registered against them in the past. We maintain a list of contractors who there's been complaints against, and the complaint process is very simple. If you've been aggrieved by a home improvement contracting program, you can file a complaint with our office. We have attorneys on staff that conduct hearings, and they'll hear evidence, and they'll they can make one of four determinations. They can determine that there's no basis for it and dismiss it. They can determine that there was in fact a violation of the statute and regulation, and they can fine that contractor, or they can suspend that contractor's registration or revoke it. And so we encourage consumers to check the list to see if in fact there's been any complaints in which they have been disciplined for. We also suggest that you contact our office and find out what should be in a contract. It's important because if you are aggrieved by the project, let's say the individual takes the money and doesn't do the work or does shoddy work, you can file with our office, and provided you meet the criteria, recoup up to $10,000 from the guarantee fund. That is only available to those individuals who contract with a registered contractor. If the individual wasn't registered, you forfeit your ability to access
I think that's really
that.
important because I don't think people realize there is a registry like that.
Yes.
And that if you use somebody who is registered with your office, that there is this fund
Yep.
to go to
Yep.
afterward if there's a problem. I
Yep.
was not aware of that at all. I don't think most people are.
Absolutely, and it's important to point out that it's a fund of last resort. You have to meet
Right.
the criteria, you have to obtain a judgment or go through arbitration, but at the end of the day, it's there, and it's a potential source of revenue that you can be compensated with. But again, they have to be a registered contractor, it had to be a written contractor, and there are other criteria that require. And that's important to ensure, you know. So, you know, make sure that they're registered, make sure that they haven't had any complaints against them, make sure you have a written contract with all the information in there. And at the end of the day, it's also important to point out that hiring a registered contractor doesn't ensure that the work that the individual is qualified, because you and I can get an HIC. It doesn't require any training or experience.
That's
an HIC, Home Improvement Contracting.
Contracting.
What it does require is through a CSL, a Construction Supervisor License. Most work out there requires both the CSL and a HIC. Okay. Our office oversees the HIC program and the CSL. The Division of Professional Licensure recently consolidated with Department of Public Safety, and we oversee building inspectors, we oversee the construction supervisory license, amongst other things. So, and we made it very handy. You know, one of the things that the Baker-Polito administration has tried to ensure is that it's easier to do business in Massachusetts. And towards that end, the Division of Professional Licensure recently implemented what they call e-licensing, which allows all these licensees to go online and become licensed or renew their license without even having to come into Boston. And we've been able to cut down the processing time from 9 months to 3 months in some situations. So, you know, we continue to try to improve the process. But again, home improvement contracting is a big part of consumers' world out there, and there's steps that you can take. And it's also important to note that we work very closely with the Attorney General's office and District Attorney's office. We've gone after individuals. We had a woman in Newton not too long ago who decided to create an in-law apartment on her second floor, and part of the process was to remove the roof, extend the walls. The contractor came in, removed the roof, and then
afraid of where this was
left.
going.
And this was in November. So
goodness.
she's, you know, and you know some of the winters we've
There's
had
some
lately.
horror stories.
Yeah, and
Well, it's great to know that there's a way for any of us to get information beforehand to help protect us.
absolutely.
And then if last resort, a possible, at least partial way of
Absolutely.
paying for some of
And
that.
if you have any questions, again, we'll provide the toll-free number, and you can contact, and we can give you some direction. Again, it's important to note that they're not attorneys, they're not going to give legal
Right,
advice,
that's
but
right.
they can give you direction. And it's also important to note that you can go online and look up a contractor, determine whether or not they've had any complaints against them as part of your due diligence.
I think that's great. I think that's a great service.
Thank you.
And wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the various scams that we all encounter and how your office is trying to help us at least become aware of some of these scams.
Sure. Well, as we talked about, our office has a lot of specific mandates, one of which is we oversee the consumer hotline. And we have 4 students from Northeastern that oversee it and take hundreds of calls a day. And many of the calls that come in has to do with scams that are out there. And so I asked my students to provide me with a list. Some of them have been around from the forever. The IRS scam. Everyone's heard of it, but we still get calls. A lot of them, the victims are elderly, who get these calls, and the format is they call and they say, we're with the Internal Revenue Service, you owe back taxes. If you don't send us money, a warrant will be issued for your arrest. And believe it or not, people are still sending
Well, they
money.
hear IRS.
They hear IRS,
it's-
but the reality is that's not how the
How
Internal
they
Revenue
don't work
Service
that way.
works. Now there's a takeoff on that. Now they're reaching out to the immigrant population, and they're saying that if you don't, you're going to be deported. And so, you know, the IRS is probably the most well-known scam. The grandparent scam, are you familiar with that?
A little bit.
You know, and again, we're talking during the show, social media. You know, your life, my life, if you're on Facebook or any of the numerous social media outlets, is out there, you know. So what they'll do is they'll go online and access your Facebook, and they'll find out that you have a son or daughter studying abroad. You have a grandson or granddaughter studying abroad. So they'll contact you in the dead of night, and they will say, you know, we're calling you from such and such jurisdiction. Your son or daughter, and they'll have their name, and they'll talk about friends in the school that they go
Sure.
to, enough information to sound convincing. And they'll say, you need to send a money order for $5,000. Now they're using gift cards and Bitcoin. It's, you know,
gosh.
and or they'll say, I'm a lawyer and I'm representing, and you need to send money so your son or daughter can post bond. We recently had a member of our office whose mother-in-law lives in Texas. Her grandson was studying in Atlanta, Georgia. She got a call in the dead of night saying, you know what, your grandson has been detained. You need to wire $2,000 or he's going to go to county jail until the matter's been resolved. Next morning she gets up and she goes to an outlet. It was a reputable one. Our Division of Banks is training them and working with them in terms of how to identify the scams. And he said, ma'am, I'd like to take your money, but it's a scam. She promptly left there. She went to a less reputable one. They took her $2,000. Turns out to be a scam. Now she's looking to be reimbursed. It's not going to happen. You know, so that's the grandparent scam. The charity scam, you've won a lottery. All you need to do is pay taxes.
Send money.
Yeah. The Boston Globe did a series on it last year, and they had one guy who had lost $100,000, believe it or not. He had been called by number one, you know, send $10,000 and you'll collect your $1 million. And then the fourth call he got was, if you join the association, you can collect all three. Believe it or not, people are still being victimized by that. The One Ring scam, are you familiar with
No.
that? Okay, so that's what they do. There's a group operating out of the Caribbean. They will call your cell phone. They'll let it ring once. If you're like most people, you're not able to grab it on the first one, or you see there's a missed call, you want to know who called you, you call them back. Don't tell me how, ask me how it's the particulars, but the way it works is, as long as they keep you on the phone, the more they ring up a bill. And it's an international call. And this past year, I get a call on my cell phone. Like most people, I reach out to them. And one of my lawyers came by, and I mentioned to him, he said, oh, I hope you didn't call him back. And I said, I did. He said, that's the One Ring scam. So,
Wow. I
so-
wasn't at all familiar
yeah,
with that.
the National Grid scam, they call you and they say, you know what, we can lower your bill doing different things.
Oh, I get 2 or 3
You
calls
get
every
them
day.
all the time.
Every day.
Yeah. The Microsoft scam, you know, your thing's about to run out. Ransomware, I'm sure that's the cybersecurity conference that we had. I mean, the stories you hear from individuals, they'll say, you know, my grandmother, this one guy, one law enforcement officer told us at this conference that his grandmother lives in New York, and she was a victim of ransomware. And what they'll do is you'll go on a site and they'll have malware there, and they'll infect your system. And they'll contact you and they'll say, listen, you need to wire or send by Bitcoin X amount of dollars, or we're going to delete all your family photos, all your documents on it. And this one particular case, it was around Christmas time, and they wanted $500. So they gave her 24 hours, and she had been able to come up with like $450, and she reached out to them, and she said, I just need time to come up. Believe it or not, they had a little bit of a heart. They gave her another 24 hours, but then they took her
Such
5
nice
hours.
folks.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice folks.
But that's the way it works, and,
That's
it's awful.
And do all of these or most of these perpetrators work from outside the country? Again, these people I want to send to jail.
The IRS, this group operating out of upper state New York, out of Washington. You know, it's I've gotten at least a dozen calls in the last year, and then I'll engage them. You know, there was a thing that was shown on YouTube not too long ago, where a police officer on one of the departments, not here in Massachusetts, but somewhere in the United States, he gets a call on his cell phone. Now he's working dispatch. He's in uniform at a police station, and the IRS call is saying, we have a warrant for your arrest, and he's looking around, you know.
So it affects any of us.
Exactly.
All of
And
us.
so what we advise consumers, listen, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. And more importantly, take the information like the grandparents scam. We're not saying that you don't, it never happens, you know.
That's right.
But it's not likely that they're going to call you at 3 o'clock in the morning and they're going to ask you to send 4 gift cards to, you know, Europe. All right. So just common sense goes a long way. When
Be
dealing with
aware
this.
of all these things. And it's getting to
Absolutely.
the point where I don't want to answer the phone anymore.
Well, again-
Use voicemail or an answering machine.
Exactly, and it goes a long way to at least insulating you from these callers.
Well, that's not great. It's great information. It's not great to know that there are so many things like this going on.
Well-
But thank you for coming and sharing what your department does
Yeah.
and sharing with people. Just another reminder, don't fall for these things. Like you said, if it sounds too good to be true,
It probably
It
is.
probably
And again, I will provide the number. So if you are a consumer and you have an issue with home improvement contract or the do not call list or data breach, or any one of our entities, whether or not it's insurance, banks, standards, professional licensure, telecommunications and cable, call our office. We have consumer units within all these offices, all of these agencies who can help you and assist you with your issues.